Hi there, and a very, very warm welcome to this video series on BrainWorks BX XL V2. My name is Larry Holcomb, aka Get to Know, and I'm really excited to be talking about this plugin with Groove 3. Now, BX XL version 2 at its core is a plugin which is designed to allow you to get really nice, transparent, loud mixes. And it does that by having mid-side stereo limiting functionality. And on top of that, it can actually also split the signal into the mid bands of low and high, as well as the sideband, obviously, because it's a mid-side limiter. And why does this allow you to get transparent masters potentially if you use it correctly? Because you can actually have separate limiting settings for the low frequencies of the midband, the higher frequencies of the midband. We can set that using the crossover dial here, and also having separate limiting for the sideband. And that's important because, for example, in the sideband, that's where a lot of the reverb tails and delays and things like that are going to exist in the sideband. So the difference frequencies. So the difference between the left and the right hand channels. So that's the stuff that gives you the width. Now, if you have that nice and kind of floating and not limited and not too compressed, that can give you that nice kind of airy feel. So you can actually set that up so you don't have any limiting taking place on the side. And then you can have separate limiting or compression kind of stroke limiting settings for the low frequencies and high frequencies. So again, you could just say limit the mid frequencies and leave the low frequencies to have the groove that you want in there. So obviously, anytime we add kind of compression and limiting, we're actually affecting the envelope of the sound, the groove of the sound. So we could actually leave that clean, just have a compressor limiter working on the midband essentially. And that will allow us to get more kind of perceived loudness and tame peaks, but also have that nice kind of groovy low frequencies. And of course, if we don't have any limiting taking place on the side, then we get that nice airy kind of floaty sideband as well, where all the reverbs and the delays are. Because, you know, it's kind of a perceived problem with compression and limiting is it brings up a lot of the reverb tails and the delays. That's why people say it's good to work with a limiter while you're producing or mixing a track, because then you can take into consideration the fact that the compression and limiting on the stereo master will bring up all your reverbs and delays. Whereas having a kind of clean sideband means that you're not going to be bringing up the reverbs and the delays so much. And also you can actually have independent control of the level of that as well. So it's such a flexible limiter. It's not just a kind of one knob maximizer. You know, it has the ability to have multi-stage limiting because we're limiting the low frequencies, the higher frequencies and the side. But also on top of that, we have a final limiter as well, because obviously if we're starting to boost things in here using the gain boost, we could be creating new peaks that weren't there before. So we actually have a final stage of limiting as well. So that's what I mean when I say a multi-stage limiter. So very flexible plugin to allow you to get nice, clean, transparent masters. So in this first video, we're going to talk a bit about the interface of the plugin and just go through a kind of basic workflow of using the plugin. That is before we dive in more detail and look at each section. So let's have a look at the interface to start with. So we'll start at the top here. So here we have a series of meters that allow us to analyze the ratio between, in this case, the mid-low and the mid-high. So for example, if we were to boost the mid-low, you'd see this start to move to the left because now the mid-low is going to be comparatively louder than the mid-high. We then have the relationship between the mid and the side. So again, if we start boosting the sides, you'll see that move to the right and vice versa. Correlation meter is how in phase we are essentially. So again, if we started to boost the sides, we'd start to see that move towards the left. And if we started to turn down the sides, for example, we're going to move more towards the right. So this is going to be completely mono, and this is going to be completely out of phase. And then we have a balance control, which allows us to analyze the balance between the left and the right hand channels. Okay, so moving down here, this is where we have our three kind of initial compressor limiters. Now I say compressor limiter because a limiter is essentially just a compressor with an infinite ratio. And you can see we do have attack and release settings for these as well that you'd be used to seeing on a compressor. So this is going to be the band that takes care of our low frequencies. And we set what those low frequencies are by using the crossover frequency dial here. So anything below that point will be treated as mid-low. Anything above will be treated as mid-high. So we have various different controls on here. We have some saturation, as I said, attack and release. And we have the ability to set a threshold and also a gain here as well. Now, these two are basically the mono portion of the sound, split into low and high. Across the right, we have the sideband here. So this is going to be the difference. So anything which is different between the left and the right hand channels, essentially. So the stereo information is going to be treated by this fader here and this section of the plugin. Now, the next section we have is this master section here. Now, this has 3 dials that allow us to actually control the 3 dials, XL, gain boost, and threshold. See, XL, gain boost, and threshold on our 3 separate channels here, the mid, low, mid, high, and side. And we have various different options for soloing here, etc. We have a stereo master output LED section as well here, where we can look at peak and RMS. So next up, we have the I/O section here. This allows us to set an input gain here, and also a pan and mid-side amounts. So this allows us to actually set the inputs before we start tweaking any of the other settings. Now, we discussed the crossover frequency sets the balance between the mid and the high, so we can set what's going to be low, what's going to be high. Mono Maker is going to allow us to set a point at which all the frequencies are going to be mono, which is quite important, and especially if you're wanting to cut things to vinyl, actually having stereo bass can cause the needle to leave the groove of the record, so you've got to be very careful with that. Now, something I haven't mentioned yet is that this is a sidechain enabled plugin. We have a sidechain mix section down here. So we can actually set whether we want the sidechain to respond to the mid or to the side or to an external input. So for example, for electronic music, we could maybe have the kick drum triggering the processing taking place with XL V2. So there's some kind of creative applications there. And then coming down to the bottom right here, we have the summing amp gain section. Now this is where we can sum these 3 channels together and then have a final blend. So if you had everything dialed in, but you said, I just want a little bit more width, you could dial that up, or if you wanted a little bit more of the mono portion, you could bring that up from here as well. You can also link the 2 together. And when they're linked together, they basically act as an input to this final peak limiter, which is located here. So we have this peak stop, which allows us to switch on the peak limiter, and a gain reduction meter here as well. So this is basically after this summing amp gain section. And then we have a master output. Now, we can set this to whatever we want, but if we were using this as the final limiter in the chain, usually that's set to somewhere between minus 0.2 or minus 0.3, which can help if you're cutting a track to CD. Older CD players sometimes would have problems playing tracks that have been mastered all the way up to 0 dB full scale. So having a little bit of a safety net before that can be helpful. So we could just bring that down to minus 0.3 or 2, and that will allow us to have just a little bit of a safety net. Now, if we were to set this anything above 0 dB full scale, we're going to be then introducing digital distortion with our converters. So if you were going to do that, you wouldn't have this as the final limiter in the chain. There's nothing stopping you using this alongside another limiter. So you could have a further limiter later on. And if you were doing that, you could use this master output knob here to make sure that you were feeding the correct level into the limiter, which was coming downstream. But if this is going to be the final limiter for mastering, then you would want to do that to something below 0 dB. Now, if you want to reset any of these parameters, if you hold down the option key, you can reset it back to its default. Now, finally, for the interface, in addition, we have this BrainWorks toolbar at the top, which has things like bypass and has undo and redo up to 32 steps, which is very handy. And we can also compare settings using this settings section here. Okay, so that's the interface of the plugin with an overview of what is going on. Let's have a look just at a basic level of the kind of workflow we can use here. So the track we've got here is a track by Jess Beck, and it's called Back in Time. If you want to check out Jess's music, she's here on Spotify. This track's not been released yet. As you can see, there's nothing there, but I think it's launching quite soon. And here she is on Instagram. So Jess Beck Music, really cool track. Let's have a little blast of it. Really, really nice. Now, I've just got 2 plugins on here. The gain match from Let It Mix. Now, this just enables me to very quickly A and B pre and post the plugin, so we can compare tonally what's going on without getting tricked by volume. This is not anything to do with the BrainWorks suite. So it's a plugin thing you have to buy on top, but it's not expensive. It's very, very useful for demonstration purposes. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the kind of workflow we can use with BX XL V2. So we've got it on the stereo output here, the master bus. And let's just play through here. So So we can solo here, listen to the mid-low. That's our mid-high. That's our difference, so our sideband stereo information. That's actually a very useful way of deciding what you want to do with a mix as well sometimes, because if you have problems in the sideband, that means you can go back and maybe tweak EQs with reverbs and things like that. So it's actually quite good to listen to your track in solo with the mid and the side anyway. So what we could then do is turn up the input gain until we start to see a little bit of clipping, or limiting, I should say, on the limiter. As you can see that there, so we're starting to get a little bit of action on the gain reduction there. Let's set this to a little bit of a safety net there. So we've got a little tiny bit of limiting going on there. Now we have to start to use the gain boost to bring up the 3 faders here. We're going to be bringing up the mid-low, mid-high and sideband.
Did it throw you to see me playing games?
And as we do so, you see the final peak limiters seeing a bit more action going on now.
Too.
If we do this too much, just adjust your listening volume.
Saying we were all new.
We start to get some audible kind of distortion going on, and the mix will start to sound very squashed. And as we do that, you'll see we start to get gain reduction taking place on each one of our individual compressor limiters here as well.
Like I didn't know you.
Because we're starting to exceed the threshold. Now, if we start to change the threshold dials here, you'll see we'll start to get more limiting taking place.
I didn't know. Like I didn't know.
See, there's a huge amount of gain reduction taking place on each individual fader here for the mid-low, mid-high, and the side.
Don't wanna go back in time.
Now, as we know, we can change what's going to be treated as low and high frequencies using the crossover frequency dial here. Now, another thing that's cool to play with is the XL amount here. Now, this is like a saturation, which is going to give you loads of perceived loudness. So let's try that.
Time, I wanna
Let's just loop a section over here.
us to you. Don't wanna go back in time. I wanna heal tonight. Truth cuts like a knife.
Now, obviously, I'm way overdoing this just for demonstration purposes, but you can hear the XL adds quite a lot of perceived volume and saturation. Now, as we're doing this, we want to always be keeping a look at our final limiter here to make sure we're not introducing too much limiting. And then finally,
Us to you.
we've got a nice way of controlling the overall width.
Us to you.
So we could be more mono
Us to you.
or more stereo using the summing amp gain. So hopefully that just gives you a quick way of understanding how you can kind of interact with this plugin. So if you want to get going quickly, that's just a quick start guide to using this plugin. So in this video, we've covered the interface of the plugin, what it's all about. We know at a basic level what each section's for, and we had a very, very quick start guide to kind of getting something going with the plugin. Okay, so now we've covered the interface and a basic overview of this plugin. In the next video, we're going to have a look at the input section over here, and also the crossover frequency and mono maker section down here. So I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.